It's disappointing that the new government's stirring up division around the Treaty of Waitangi. Don't get me wrong, I'm all up for asking the tough questions, but that's not what's going on here, and I want to explain why. You might have heard about the Treaty Principles Bill. It's David Seymour's idea, but Chris Luxon has agreed to it being debated as part of the coalition deal. It's pitched as simply explaining what the treaty principles are, but that's not what it really does. It twists the words of the treaty and tries to make them something that they're not and were never intended to be. But let's be straight, Seymour's a slick salesman, and that's why I wanted to take some time to set out the big mistakes in his approach. I'm Duncan Webb, the Justice spokesperson for the Labour Party. Here's what you need to know. Look, the first and most basic error is the claim that the treaty is about individual rights rather than a partnership between peoples. A treaty defines the relationship between peoples or nations. That's what a treaty is. The Treaty of Waitangi is a blueprint for how Māori and Crown deal with each other. The ACT Party hates that. They want to relegate the treaty to a historical charter about the interaction of individual Māori with individual non-Māori, and the Treaty Principles Bill doubles down on that. But that's not how treaties work. A treaty is between self-governing peoples and plots the path forward in respect of their ongoing relationship. It's simply false to suggest that any treaty, including the Treaty of Waitangi, creates individual rights between citizens. The Treaty Principles Bill is an effort to limit the scope of the treaty and undermine the fact that Māori occupy a particular place in New Zealand. The second fallacy is that the words of the treaty define the extent of the relationship between Crown and Māori. This is wrong in a whole lot of ways. Like any document, the treaty is more than its words. Its context and history are important in understanding it. No document creates an entire relationship. This is even more so for a treaty, and more again for the Treaty of Waitangi. The treaty was agreed between Māori, as the first inhabitants of Aotearoa, and English immigrants. That imbalance is at the heart of the emergence of the principles of the treaty. When the treaty was signed, many of the concepts, sovereignty, ownership, citizenship, government, were alien to Māori, and the idea of an absolute cession of their rights as rangatira, or chiefs, was fundamentally at odds with the world they lived in. In these circumstances, the treaty marked the beginning of a relationship, an indication of direction, as well as a constitutional foundation stone. The third sleight of hand is the claim that the treaty is the same now as it was in 1840. In reality, any relationship changes over time and adapts to circumstances. And when the relationship started over 180 years ago, it's even more the case. That's why the really important thing is the essence of the treaty, the underlying principles that can guide behaviour into the future. The reality is that the treaty relationship evolves, and so does its spirit. The treaty, as with all of our constitution, flexes and adapts, as it must, to changing circumstances. Historical context is really important, but equally the treaty is always speaking, and it remains relevant and modern. That's why we can meaningfully talk about things like radio spectrum and te reo as a tonga. The fourth and perhaps the real flaw at the heart of the bill is the fallacy that the partnership relationship between the Crown and Māori means unequal treatment in some way. There's a nasty subtext to this suggestion, and it's that treaty gives to Māori and takes away from others. It's just not how it works. Look, it became clear early on that the Crown was the senior partner in the relationship with Māori. What the treaty settlements process has shown us is that for a very long time, the Crown ignored its responsibility to promote and protect the interests of Māori. In many cases, it did the opposite. The principle of partnership does not mean putting some people ahead of others. Rather, it's just a duty to act in good faith, fairly and reasonably. Where one party has more power and resources, the burden will probably fall more heavily on that party. When that doesn't happen, it needs to be fixed. Look, fifth is the misleading suggestion that putting the principles in an act will capture meaning rather than change it. The fact is that Seymour's bill seeks to rewrite the treaty. The Treaty Principles Bill is a dishonest, cherry-picking and reframing of snippets of the treaty. The treaty is a sweeping document that sets a path for a relationship between peoples. The Treaty Principles Bill dismisses it as if it's of no lasting significance. It suggests that the treaty, rather than preserving the right to be Māori, simply said, you can be one of us. It dishonestly edits out critical promises in the treaty. Important parts of the treaty disappear in a puff of dodgy drafting. Sixth, underpinning the entire approach is the delusion that absolute equality results in fair outcomes. The promise to treat everyone the same is seductive. It's simple, it seems fair. But the error is obvious, people are different. Look, if life was a running race, we know that some people begin well behind the start line, others face hurdles not of their making. If the fit and unhindered set the rules, we know who'll get the prizes. If taken too far, equal treatment becomes the tyranny of the majority, with no accommodation made for difference or need. We need to ensure fair treatment, equitable treatment, and help based on these principles. To discuss what that means for Māori is absolutely fair and proper, but to say that Māori must be treated exactly the same, when the statistics tell us that there are differences that desperately need addressing, is both unfair and inequitable. The seventh problem is the scaremongering suggestion that recognising Māori as First People in New Zealand is inconsistent with fundamental human rights. Recognising First Peoples' rights is a critical part of human rights. The Treaty Principles Bill essentially seeks to distill the treaty into something that Seymour understands and isn't afraid of, a view of the world in which individual rights dominate and groups are invisible and customary rights don't exist. That cuts across reality. Māori are our first people, and when Europeans arrived, there was already a system and structure of customs, including collectivism. Those concepts and traditions couldn't just be lifted up and slotted into limiting English legal concepts like ownership, possession and government. So we need to work at not just accommodating customary rights, but embracing and empowering them. Look, but perhaps the oddest perversion of the treaty in Seymour's bill is the attempt to take the key concept of tino rangatiratanga, the essence of chiefly authority, and to diminish it into some kind of individual right to liberty. Tino rangatiratanga was the fundamental principle of authority that the treaty preserved for Māori. Because the treaty is about the relationship between Māori and the Crown, the preservation of rangatiratanga is the right of Māori to self-determination. It's more than just a right to keep lands, forests and fisheries. It extends to all taonga, all treasured things. But it's so much more than an individual right. In part, it's the right of iwi and hapu to choose what it means to be Māori, how to utilise and treasure their taonga, and how to address the challenges ahead. Look, the last knife being stuck into the treaty is the suggestion that it undermines the democratic principles of the rule of law. The opposite is true. The treaty is many things, including a legal document, and adhering to and honouring the treaty is part and parcel of adhering to the rule of law. The rule of law includes the Crown keeping its promises and respect for legal rights, including customary legal rights. To throw the treaty in the trash and replace it with some platitudes would be to overturn 150 years of legal development and progress, just to placate the ACT Party. Look, finally, debate is healthy, so let's have an honest one. It's a pity that this debate has been triggered by the dog whistling of Seymour, and it's rapidly become a them and us tit for tat. There is a real and healthy debate to be had about the treaty, the way in which the Crown adheres to the spirit of the promises made in a world which is changing rapidly, the way in which Māori exercise their tino rangatiratanga both in a traditional setting and in a modern world. How that affects the rights and expectations of other New Zealanders, and how this all fits in with the challenges facing us, like the effect of climate change on the environment and the loss of biodiversity, economic challenges and the cost of living, including houses. They're all important. Those discussions can be useful and sometimes uncomfortable, but this demonstrates that the treaty strengthens New Zealand and gives us a resource that can put us ahead of the rest. That's because the treaty is not a dead letter, it's a living thing. To trap it in legislation and cage its principles would ultimately be to kill it. Perhaps that's what Seymour really wants.